So let me get started. So this is entitled Mea Culpa, a retrospective look at some CSCW stuff with implications for future research. And it's really kind of a personal talk. I told Michael a little bit earlier that in the last 24 hours, I've rewritten the back half of the talk 3 times. So we'll see what happens. And if I fall asleep in the middle of the talk, someone just kind of mention it to me. Okay, so as Michael said, I'm at the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and also in the School of Information. I have a double appointment. And I have a whole bunch of other affiliations that I won't go into. Okay, so the basic idea of this talk is what happens when our ideas move into practice. So I've done a lot of product development. I was a working engineer for about 6-7 years before I went back and got a PhD. Have had a lot of luck and had really successful products and also projects. There were a number of things. This is a quote from a poster. I used to study astrophysicists, and this was about an observatory, a space-based observatory. And it turned out that the detectors were bad, and they kept finding galactic objects that weren't there. And then they had to correct for them. So the really wonderful line on the poster was, we had some underappreciated problems at time of launch. And I think that's kind of true of parts of my career as well. So I wanted to talk about this. Many of you are quite young, and maybe it'll be a cautionary tale for you. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, and this, I think, also has implications for implementation science. So in the medical world, there's this whole branch of medicine that discusses implementation science, basically how to get things out into the field. And we might want to consider that as well. All right, but first, what I want to do is thank my colleagues at Michigan and elsewhere for helping me along with this. I won't name all of them. They are not at all responsible for this talk, except in the positive ways. Any deficits are definitely mine. Alone. But I'm very fortunate at Michigan to be surrounded by a bunch of people, especially in the School of Information, where people actually have kind of a critical approach and a social science approach towards technology. And by the way, you can interrupt me whenever you want. I'm fine with that. So the goal of this talk, as I mentioned, is what happens when our ideas move out into the world, into practice. And I'm going to do a mixed message. Some people have likened my talk, I've done a couple versions of this, to Debbie Downer, if you're familiar with that, for Saturday Night Live. So I feel it incumbent upon me. I've been told to maybe make it a little bit happier. So I'll do that. It goes against my personality, but I'll see what I can do. So I just want to remind us that CSCW, ACI has had some really important impacts. So I don't want to lose that. I'm going to talk about some of the downsides. But of course, we've had major successes. So all kinds of products like Google Docs, Zoom, distributed games, scientific laboratories, maybe even the web. And then, one of the things that actually I don't believe anyone's actually studied is all the distributed work for the COVID vaccine. I mean, that was literally this generation's moonshot, and it could not have been possible without social computing. Everything had to be done at a distance. And I think another really important thing that intellectually we've contributed is the sense that many technologies are socio-tech in nature, socio-technical. And I was reading the NIST report on AI risk, and one of the interesting things was in the first couple of pages, it says, look, you have to understand this problem is socio-technical. And it was like, whoa, that's a very dramatic impact when major bodies are talking about that. We're not the only field that talks about that. Obviously, there are others dating many years before CSCW. But I think it's important, and I think we help spread it. Okay, and I also want to note that HCI, CSCW, has moved forward in its intellectual effort. So we've incorporated new stuff in the last 10 years. So there's been a lot of moves. Many of you are probably already doing this, but practice theory, postmodernism, STS has really invaded CSCW, or maybe we've invaded it, I'm not sure. There's been a lot of new technologies, reputation systems, and crowdsourcing, and I'll talk about AI stuff a little bit later. And I want to acknowledge all the people that I'm suspecting are in the room that are kind of the next generation of researchers, and you're tackling some serious issues around fairness and accountability, understandability, transparency, et cetera. And so the field, I think, is very lively, and we're trying to understand what's going on. So a lot of this talk is looking back at, and it's a very personal talk, but I think the question is how to think about future research efforts at the same time. Okay, so as I said, today's talk is a little bit of a downer. Everybody with me? You guys are being very quiet. There's no coffee in the room except for mine. Okay, pretend you have coffee. So this is going to be a less benign talk. I'm not really going to talk about the successes of CSCW, maybe a little bit. I'm going to talk about dealing with kind of downstream effects and the wicked nature of them, wicked in the social science sense. And I'm going to use two cases, privacy and misinformation. They're both cases from my life. They're largely personal, as I mentioned. So they're going to be privacy and misinformation. The first one actually is misinformation. So there's a few people that look like they have enough gray hair in the room that may remember this with virtual communities. This is Reingold's book, which kind of started things off. And the idea was we're all going to get to know each other over the net. We're going to find out what each other's like. It's going to be great. We're going to live in peace and harmony because we're just going to experience how wonderful we all are. Kind of didn't turn out that way. So my area is expertise sharing, which is kind of like knowledge sharing, but is about people instead. So it was like one of the beginning things in social computing. And expertise sharing is awesome, right? We do it, you all do it probably every day. My favorite example comes from a University of Washington study where a woman wanted to find out what it was like to be on chemo. And of course, doctors don't really know that personally. And so she got a lot of additional information. But what she really wanted to know was, what was it like to teach on chemo? Right? Because she was an elementary school teacher. And so that kind of thing is only available from other people. And so there's been just an explosion of that kind of sharing online. But these are some grim statistics. I think the number is actually a little bit higher. Nearly 60% believe that it's somewhat fairly or very true that the government does not tell the truth about the dangers of vaccines. If you've read the recent news, it may be even higher. The healthcare system experiments on patients without them knowing about the experiments was held by 43% of the respondents. Right? So a lot of mistrust, a lot of misinformation being shared, depending on your point of view, it's misinformation. And so that's problematic. I did a study 2016, 2017 of 8chan, which is now 8kun. So how many of you know about 8chan? How many of you know about 4chan? Okay, so 4chan has been called the cesspool of the internet. And 8chan were all the people that got kicked off of 4chan for being too extreme. Okay, and it was a great, very interesting study. Couldn't do it for very long. I mean, I would read the stuff for about an hour, and then I'd have to detox for 3 weeks because it was just, I don't know, everything I didn't believe in. So, this is just some examples. So this is them thinking how powerful they are. This was their image of themselves a little bit, which was a Tyrannosaurus Rex smoking a cigarette back in the alley, I guess. This was really interesting stuff. I had actually logs, I still have logs, of them taking apart the Podesta emails from the Clinton campaign. And they were very active in trying to, in some sense, subvert the normal view of what was going on. I do want to mention that this is not new. I'm too young to remember the McCarthy era, but as many of you know, that was a time I had friends whose parents lived through that. It was a very grim time. There was also a Red Scare in the 1920s where people were imprisoned. I'm from the Detroit area. Ford basically sponsored anti-Semitism in the United States in the 30s. And so it's been going on for a long time. There's a wonderful book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics that I recommend. That's a historical treatment. And one of the interesting things is Usinski and Parrott in 2014 did a nice set of studies that basically asserted that actually this conspiracy stuff's been here for the last 100 years, and it's actually been relatively even. But we'd all kind of agree that there's something going on here. It seems to be more pervasive. It seems to be more in our faces than maybe earlier stuff. So here's an example of some stuff that's on poll. And notice the date. It's right before that election. It's a plan to establish a far-left dictatorship in America, et cetera, et cetera. They want to crash the system with welfare and destroy American culture and economy. With same-sex marriage, feminism, welfare, and race riots, right? So a lot of we could call it social computing, maybe not in its best face, right? So people sharing their particular ideologies together and creating a community. And the communities of Nazis have been online since the 1960s. But now it's very easy to find and very, very identifiable. And then it shades off into complete conspiracy stuff like CERN is run by warlord bankers from Geneva, which I think is a really great idea. CERN is, of course, the accelerators in Switzerland. Okay. Yes. In addition to warlord over banking, yeah. Good point. Thank you. All right. So knowledge sharing became misinformation. In fact, it's kind of the interesting inverse of it, right? So you start sharing information. We all thought it was going to be great. We'd all learn to love each other. And then it turned out that actually sharing information was also brought out all the other stuff. So, there's some really big negatives about knowledge sharing. It's hard to handle at scale. And just as a personal note, I really bought into this imaginary. I really thought that the world was going to be better through my social computing efforts. Didn't kind of exactly foresee the consequences. I'll come back to that in a minute. Everybody with me? More or less? Okay. So what happened? Well, Craigslist, the Facebook, right? A bunch of other stuff along the way. The second example that I want to talk about is surveillance capitalism. This comes from a book by Zuboff, who talks about basically you capture data and you can use it for advertising, all kinds of stuff, and she calls it surveillance capitalism, which I think is a good name for it. So this story is about 10 years earlier, and it's my effort with the P3P project, the Platform for Privacy Preferences project, at the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the standards body, essentially, for the web. This is a book by Lori Craner, who I have to say, I did work on it. I was the editor of the original spec, which is essentially the author. But it was really Lori's and Joseph Riegel's project. Okay, so P3P. Is anybody familiar with P3P? It's kind of gone at this point. So remember cookies? Not the Oreos, but the web cookies? Okay, that was P3P. That's what we've ended up bringing you. It's not what we intended. Okay, so what happened? Well, essentially it was a labeling protocol for personal data. It was about 1997 and on. So here's some text. I apologize for that glaring color. P3P is designed to help users reach informed agreements with services. And the idea was to do it automatically, right? So the site would say what its privacy policies were, what data it wanted. You had an agent of some sort, computational, intelligent, that would make agreements, would either decide to do it or not do it. as a first step towards reaching agreement, a service sends a machine-readable P3P proposal in which the organization responsible for the service declares its identity and privacy practices. Very innovative at the time. And the idea that proposals could be automatically parsed by user agents. And then users need not read the privacy policies at every website to be assured. Okay, this, as Michael mentioned, one of the works that I'm known for is a paper called The Socio-Technical Gap, where I discuss this. It's an impossible thing to really do well. In my analysis, it requires the users to understand an 8-dimensional space and visualize it in their heads. And I don't know about you, but I'm not that great at 8-dimensional spaces. And the other problem is that if anything goes wrong ever, the user will never come back to it because it's their privacy. So the project didn't really kind of work. It was a nice try, maybe, but we'll come back to that too. Okay, so how did P3P come to be? Well, in 1995, 1996, the web was new. You guys were not born, probably. Anybody not born? 1995, close. Okay, yeah. I find it very disconcerting when I ask that question to my undergraduates. So in 1995, the web is new. Nobody knows what's going on. It's all chaotic. And there were calls for many people to regulate the web and deal with privacy. And in 1997, the US Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, decided to start looking into this. The tech world countered very quickly. They did not want regulation. The claim was government regulation will stall or kill technical progress. And so the idea was let's come up with a technical way to deal with this, which was P3P, and avoid over-regulation and solve the problem too. Okay, now the thing about this project was everybody on the project had the best of intentions, except maybe one company, which I was pretty sure was there to kill it. But everybody else was great. I mean, the person from Microsoft, the person from AT&T, the person from IBM, they were all there. They were trained sociologists, or they were like married to sociologists, or they were marketing people, or kind of like lay sociologists. They really understand the nature of the social world at a very deep and profound level. And we all thought this was going to be a new way to facilitate privacy. By the way that I got onto it was because I did both technology and social stuff, and the people at the W3C wanted somebody that they knew that could be on that. And Joseph and Lori are both that way too. All right, so the conclusion. As I mentioned, Zuboff has called P3P the beginning of surveillance capitalism. So this is another mea culpa. The first was like, did I kind of help misinformation spread? And now, was I kind of part of the beginnings of surveillance capitalism? Okay, we'll come back to that. You can throw rocks later. All right, the rest of the story. So in 2011, Facebook starts doing customized ads. They need to attract and keep users to be able to gather data, to do personalized ads, and also to offer ads to people. What keeps people glued to the site? Controversy, right? So the whole point is now you could start getting data, right? Because there's no regulation. The government regulation has been forestalled. And now you want misinformation on your site in order to spread controversy and get revenue. All right. So I mentioned underappreciated at time of launch. These were not things that I understood at all. I thought I was doing a service to the entire world in both projects. I thought they were cool projects. You'll notice the two cases are conjoint in SCS. This is called path dependencies. And one kind of begets the next, and you proceed as time goes on. Okay, everybody's still with me? Cool. All right. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is arguments invoking utopianistic imaginaries, as STS would call it, things that promise the hope of we're going to live in a better world. Sometimes they're true, but sometimes they can be used to prevent governance. And ideas of technical progress towards those utopias can also lead to prevention of governance that might be actually quite useful. That's my lesson from it. So this is a mea culpa, as I mentioned. Mea culpa is something that's done to kind of apologize for the bad things you've done in the world. Probably I should give you all new cars or something instead. But unfortunately, I didn't buy into. I only helped. I didn't actually buy into it. So there's no easy solutions. That's a bit of a downer, either personal for me or scientific for the community. And what I want to do in the rest of the talk is talk a little bit about what I think this offers as a lesson. So, right, if all I do is stop and I just say, oh, I messed up, you guys all get to say, well, I won't, or that is, you won't. Or you'll go, okay, so he's an idiot, but we're going to be okay. So let's talk about that. Okay, and this is reflection back and hopefully kind of forward as well. Okay, and I just want to mention, I kind of already said this, but this is not just personal. These two things had profound effects. Social cohesion has been harmed in many ways. Social stability has become much more problematic. And even what sociality, that is the idea of being in something collective, we are starting to have a fragmented sense of that as well. Now, again, I want to stress that, the United States, by the way, my original major was history before I did technical stuff. We've gone through this before, so this is not quite as bleak as maybe it might sound. But this is a period of profound shattering of a lot of collective beliefs. Okay, so I want to know what this is that happened to me. And I want to know if whatever this is inevitable. Now, the interesting thing is, as Michael mentioned, I haven't just done those two projects. I actually did computer games. I don't feel like I destroyed the world. There were people, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. There were people that thought I was destroying the world, but I feel okay about the video game thing. Okay, I've also done other stuff like banking, and I did the X11 Windows system, or I did large-scale distributed computing. Those are okay. I don't feel real guilty about those. I don't think they harm the world in any way. So aside from me, what do those two experiences have to say? So the causes of whatever this was, we'll come back to that, I think are very hard. They're very hard. So one of them is it's very hard to see the downstream consequences at the beginning. Had no idea what was going to happen. None of the people on P3P had any idea what was happening. I've recently gone back, because I'm kind of a paper hoarder, and gone back and looked at some of the news articles and the semi-academic papers around the time. Not really a mention of what was about to happen with data surveillance or anything else like it. So I don't think it was understood and we just ran over it. I don't think it was very understood. And that was certainly true of misinformation as well. There were some people talking about it at the beginning, but not very many. So I think the difficulty is that this is these are emergent network effects spreading exponentially with a lot of societal level reach. Right? And they're almost impossible to see at the beginning. I think they are impossible to see at the beginning, certainly in its full detail. So I asked Michael if it would be okay to use one of his things as an example. So I'm going to use that as well. So
this is after you made the slide, you asked me. But yes.
Well, but you're not on this slide.
Okay.
I would have just gone blithely by. You had the right of refusal. There's been some really wonderful work on kind of artificial users, right? Using LLMs to create the facsimiles of actual people. And this is a great idea. I think it's a really exciting idea. The tech part of me is really excited. The social scientist part of me is really excited. And I have absolutely no idea what will happen over time. I can imagine it's going to be really great. And I have no real concept of what the downsides will be. I don't think, again, because I'm an idiot, I think it's just not clear at the beginning. And I think this has profound implications about the kinds of designs we do and the kinds of research that we do. So let me walk through this a little more carefully. Great work, though. All right. So this is actually from another paper you're on, too. Despite the impending widespread deployment of foundation models, we currently lack a clear understanding of many things, but what they're even capable of due to their emergent properties. So, and we're discovering new things about ChatGPT all the time, right? So one of them is artificial users, but there are many other new things being done. Okay, so whatever it was this is caused by a wicked problem, which is we live in a world where it's impossible to understand the downstream consequences because the world is just too complex and actually quite dynamic as well, right? So even if you understood it at any given point, which I believe is actually impossible, is going to change very quickly, right? And that becomes combinatoric in trying to understand what the downstream consequences are going to be. So first point is don't think that you can understand the downstream effects at the time of design or release. Maybe, I did Windows systems, sure. I could figure out where they were going to go. But I think a lot of social computing in particular, maybe AI now too, or definitely AI now, is not understandable because it's going to profoundly change the context in which it's released. So you can't anticipate, but wait a minute. The rest of engineering doesn't get to build unsafe things, right? So back in your grandparents' day, this is like what happened when cars crashed. They just kind of completely smashed up, even though they were made of probably 50 times more steel than current cars. And until Ralph Nader released a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and that actually started regulation in the United States about cars. It was fought over for many, many years. So this is being swept up in unanticipated consequences. And then the question that I think comes up is, could we be better at controlling the downstream consequences? So not anticipating them, but actually controlling them, right? So thinking about them over time. All right, so there's a bunch of possibilities that I have. I guess I have a little bit of time. I'll run through these really quickly. So the worst possibility of all of these things is research efforts will be necessarily co-opted. This is the Debbie Downer of all of this. You all recognize this, I assume. We'll get assimilated. And this comes in a couple different varieties, which is live with it. If you don't know what big boy pants are, you can Google it or whatever you want to use, ask an LLM. Or pick a problem that's commercially uninteresting. So this was one of the solutions for faculty when I was a grad student. They kind of picked places where they could just kind of go off by themselves. Didn't need corporate money, didn't really want to attract corporate interest, and they would just kind of do their own thing. And so that's a real possibility. I don't find any of these particularly interesting myself. I certainly don't want to just live with it, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this talk. But I also want to have an influence in the world. I was trying to help the world. I'm going to assume that most of you are here because you also want to help the world. Or, I don't know, you came for the snacks. All right.
Disappointed by the lack of snacks.
And obviously I'm not giving you cars either. So the next possibility is that there'll be some technical solution. I feel it incumbent to kind of mention this. So there have been a lot of efforts in the fairness literature or accountability or many different areas to create mathematical definitions and say those are going to cure the problem forever. I think it's really unlikely. We haven't seen it yet. And even if we do see it, there's a nice paper that points out that even if some solution shows up for a while, it's not going to be right for all time. So eventually it'll just decay as a solution. And those of you that are technical should probably remember this. So maybe by self-regulation by industry, this has been tried a whole bunch of times. The Direct Marketing Association back in the P3P days really pushed their own ability to govern them themselves. You remember spam because it's been completely solved now, right? Not really. So self-regulation generally never works. Maybe it works occasionally. I haven't found any cases recently. Okay. Another viewpoint which part of me likes and part of me doesn't like is to start thinking about critical computing more seriously. So this is mostly a leftist view, a fight against neoliberalism. It's politically very just. I really want to find something that I can do today. I don't know if I'm going to ever see the revolution. I played with the left when I was young. I found it riven by different factions. And it's great, and I still think of myself as leftist. Hi, Trump. I want to find some stuff that's more approachable in the short run. But come and talk to me in a year, and you might see this as the primary solution. All right, so what I want to know is what can be done about trying to deal with downstream consequences. And it turns out much of the wickedness, in the sense of it being a wicked problem, is about temporal features. And so one thing that we're not very good at in the US is long-term governance. This, by the way, is a report from the National Academies that talks about this in computer science. So regulation. Okay, I have to do a disclaimer here. I am not a policy person. I am not a lawyer. I do not even play one on television. I know relatively little about it, although I have actually spent a lot of time trying to decipher those literatures. And they're pretty interesting. So maybe in addition to being a socio-tech person, I'll become a social-technical regulatory person. So regulation is often useful when there are unseen or mispriced externalities. There's an enormous literature, really enormous literature on what that means. Its relationship to innovation, its relationship to market conditions, et cetera. And there are a lot of empirical cases of regulation's effectiveness. So the ones that you probably know are pollution and in healthcare. The electric grid is another one. Even cars at this point are much safer than they used to be because of regulation, and they pollute a lot less. Okay, the downside is there's only a limited number of bases for regulation. So basically in the United States, it's going to be things like monopoly and fraud. Those are the major two. The FTC actually has a lot of power, or it did until a couple of weeks ago, to make more wide-scale investigations. That's under change, obviously, right now. But it tends to focus mostly on monopoly and fraud conditions, pricing conditions. Those are not really great for the kinds of governance that we're talking about, because these are not about monopolies. Yes, Facebook is undergoing a monopoly trial right now, but that took a very long time to get through, right? And it's not actually maybe what the real problem is for Facebook and misinformation. In the US, regulation is very heavily contested, especially at first. And I went back and I looked at the history of many of these regulatory movements. It takes an incredible amount of time to get started. So the car thing was decades. People knew that they were unsafe, and yet it took wide-scale revulsion against car fatalities before anything happened. Many of the regulatory things that you're used to, that we're all used to, started with the Gilded Era in the United States, so 1870 to 1910, basically, where the first wave of what are now billionaires were a little bit too profligate. And there were a lot of predatory pricing conditions on things like railroads and oil and things like that. And you know many of these names. So these excesses in the Gilded Age led to what was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which later turned into the FTC. More fundamentally, the problem with regulation in this, and the reason it's heavily contested at first, it's really difficult when it's unclear what the consequences are going to be. So if we know that a car crash kills people, we can start to think about getting rid of car crashes. And once we start thinking about getting rid of car crashes, we can think about the kinds of regulations that may force the externalities into a price condition. If we don't know what the consequences are yet, all bets are off the table. Now, this is a US condition. If we were in Europe, Europe takes a much more proactive view. There are many people in the United States that hope that Europe will solve our problems because they will force some level of regulation, and US companies will have to do it. That was actually true with privacy. It's not clear what will happen. It's often not clear. So the bottom line is probably this won't save, and I said you, but actually it won't save us. Right? Regulation is a very blunt instrument, not because I think it hampers innovation, which maybe it does, but maybe that's necessary, but because nobody quite knows where to put the knife at the beginning. Okay, so the thing that I want to focus on in the last 5 minutes of this talk is basically thinking about incremental improvements towards this long-term governance. So I've already said, aside from the revolution or living with it, aside from the hopes for regulation, are there things that we can do over the course of your careers, at the course of my career, to try to deal with some of this stuff? So I'm looking for smaller possibilities. So I really like Christian Sandvik's push for algorithmic auditing. So if we can get data sets, and we can get enough interaction with algorithms, we can start to understand what the algorithms do and don't do. And this seems like something that the government could regulate. It's not a major request in many senses, right? So one of the other studies that I did many years ago was the FAA and the way that they worked with a company like Boeing to deal with very proprietary data. And it turned out that, you know, in order to understand whether planes are safe, there's somebody that has to be an FAA person looking at it. But they also have to get to what Boeing called the crown jewels, you know, the exact specifications for the airframe. And that's been worked out over the course of 20 or 25 years, maybe 50 at this point. So I think this is possible. I think this would be a major win. I'm going to really suggest that this is something that we as a community could start pushing for. I think that another thing, and one of the things I did actually when I was at MIT in 2000 was to start talking to people in Washington to try to get proposals on the table before problems showed up. So basically, when a problem shows up and there is consensus that something has to happen, there is a proposal for how to deal with it ready to go. I think that we can do that. We are the right people to do that. We are technically trained people. Many of the people in DC are not, so some synergy back and forth between policy people and legal people and us would be a major win. And this also goes with the last one, which are background studies for the policy people. So again, this is very far from Washington, D.C., but you know, some of you will migrate east. And you know, that there's a certain amount of education that needs to go on at the government level. So I'm really going to push for those things. Okay, so conclusion to this. Or the conclusion for the part of the talk. This that happened for me was two gaps that can't be easily resolved. So the first one is between what we know now and what might be. None of you probably has a crystal ball. If you do, call me. I'd really like to buy the right stocks. But I suspect that none of us do. We don't really know what to do about it. The second thing is we don't know how to govern or control once we understand. So in the US, once a product's released, it's kind of gone. Right? We don't have this continuous oversight capability in the United States. It's only when it becomes incredibly egregious that the government might step in. Okay, and I want to mention that, even though I discuss this in terms of personal cases, this is not just personal. It's also, I think, a big social issue. All right. What I want to conclude on, though, is today. So in 2023, there was a federal AI order that directed agencies to guard against potential harms of AI applications, to consider them and warned against irresponsible uses that, quote, reproduced and intensified existing inequalities, caused any times of harmful discrimination, et cetera. NIST released a report on AI risk. There are efforts that are actually just starting in the EU to come up with policy formulations, regulatory formulations. However, after the election, Trump rescinded the executive order, and the argument was it's premature to regulate now. It will stifle technical advance. I kind of agree with that, but you should notice that this is often this has been a warning signal in American politics, that the reason not to regulate is because we'll slow things down too much. It's kind of true. Maybe we need to do that anyway. Okay, and on that note, I'll end. I would really love a debate, or at least some indications of what you all think about the possibilities for this. And I probably have at least a few libertarians in the room. I might even have, if this were Michigan, I would have some far-right people in the room. Don't know about here, but yeah. Are you volunteering as a far-right person, or is it? Okay.
As part of not anticipating, I think that is the most.
I'm sorry,
not being able to anticipate part of that in the future. I mean, I think a lot of people who watch CSCW as a field would say, hey, these guys are just ignoring and all about, what can we do on Wikipedia, and ignoring a lot of harmful things that were going on for a long time because they had such rose-colored lenses on the glasses about social computing. Here at Stanford, this guy Bernstein's been involved with a thing we call it Ethics and Society Review. When we give money as part of the Institute for Humans and AI, we don't release the money unless they pass that review. We just ask them to speculate on potential impact of the technology if it were to become ubiquitous or very prevalent in society. And I agree, you can't always come up with that correctly. And I think even just that process gets researchers who are used to not having to think about it all, using excuses of, oh, I'm just an engineer, I'm just making the basic research, to kind of think about those things and think about what they might do. And I'm wondering, yes, that won't catch all harms, but is it possible that some people, if they had speculated on things like Facebook, that they might have speculated on some of those harms? Are you sure that we just throw out our hands and say we can't?
I'm sorry, we can't.
We can't anticipate what some of the downsides are and do something about it when we're developing talk about it.
Yeah.
Earlier said
that's a fair.
The discussion doesn't start until 10 years too late.
That's a fair point. So I guess my claim is we can't anticipate all of the consequences. And that's the problem. So I also didn't mention in the talk all kinds of other kinds of solutions, speculative design, participatory design. There are many attempts to stave off some of these downstream consequences, but I think they're still really profound.
I mean, I would also claim one other one I'd argue for is changing who is on the teams in industry that create these things, putting those people in separate orgs and saying, hey, do trust and safety at the end has been shown to they will always lose to release the product and make more money. But if instead that expertise is spread more in the engineering teams, the social capital of those people can change the types of products that ever get to that level.
Fair point again. That's one of the reasons I brought up the expertise on the P3P group, because there was that pretty widespread expertise. I think the more difficult it is to anticipate the externalities and the exponential growth, the much more likely it is to have these kinds of downstream consequences. So again, I did other projects, and they did not cause these kinds of harms. I think the people that were on P3P were actually quite good. I don't think anybody actually thought that. I don't think we were blind to the social world. I think it was just really hard to see, 20 years later, something was going to pop up.
I agree with you that I think the auditing part is probably key, because I think a lot of kind of emerging guidances in different kind of professional areas are like, okay, well, just somehow choose things responsibly. Like when you're going to be using a tool, think about how that could work. But there's not really enough information out there for people to do that in terms of benchmarking or auditing. And so I was wondering if you have any specific thoughts on the kind of ideal structure of auditing or benchmarking in terms of what entities should be involved in that, and how that involvement potentially maybe biases certain kind of results and things like that.
So I think one of the strengths of having an auditing infrastructure is, in a lot of engineering, we don't do one-shot designs. We improve over time, we change things, we monitor them. And we don't really do that for a lot of these technologies very well, at least from the governance side. So I want to say that it's not just a one-shot, we study it and then we build it. I would defer to Christian Sandvik's efforts, where he's actually done things with the FTC and stuff to try to get this stuff started. The problem is people don't want to release any capability, get into their algorithms, and this is going to require maybe some regulatory movement. Right now, companies are really just withdrawing data sets from the public domain. It's very hard. So that's not a great answer, but that's the best I can do.
No, that's great. Thank you.
That's all I can do.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think following up on
this question, a conversation I was having with a critical design, critical computing colleague of mine not long ago was around how in one of their projects in early 2010s around reproductive health, they were imagining consequences. And they were right in the consequences they imagined. But the reflection they were having was that they didn't go far enough. And I wonder if that's actually a human bias that we have, where we just don't want to imagine the worst people existing, or the worst people getting a hold of our products. Because if they do, then really bad things can happen. I bet if any of us in this room imagines the worst people getting a hold of an idea they're working on right now, probably something really bad can come out of it. And yet, if you do that, at the global scale, right? If something you do, if you imagine it being deployed at the global scale and being, and there existing really bad people in the world, those two things, I think we can imagine harms that are really bad, but maybe part of us just doesn't want to believe that the absolute worst.
Well, I think that was certainly true of me, right? I did not reflect on that the imaginary wouldn't happen in both cases. The only thing I can say in my defense were there were a lot of other people who didn't imagine it either. But, and that's just so I want to offer mea culpa. I do not believe that I single-handedly destroyed the world. I'm not that egotistical. But I think your point is really good, right? So there's also this collective action that's occurring, right? So it's not just me not wanting to imagine a more harmful world, right?
The critical computing or critical design folks who weren't even designing the systems they were talking about or imagining alternatives for were right in imagining what they were imagining, but they were reflecting that they even weren't going far enough, right? People who weren't even the ones developing the system.
So the point that I was trying to make is that this is also a collective action problem, So in addition to my having to be convinced, I have to convince other people to do something about it, right? And so it's a collective meaning making to decide that the world is this way. And when I talked about regulation, that's the contestation that occurs. So I actually believe that the way that American politics kind of has worked for the last 100 years, is basically these massive fights, and the way that a democracy actually makes a decision that a technology is harmful gets played out in massive social action and massive social contestation. That's not a great way to do some of this stuff. But if you look at the history of like the railroads, or the history and railroad regulation, or the history of reproductive rights, or reproductive technologies, it's been heavily contested over a long period of time until it shows up in regulation. And I don't think it's just understanding that there's a problem. This is why I'm kind of drawn to the critical, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it yet, because I understand it's a valid point of view, but I don't completely know where it leads.
I guess what I
We can
was
debate
trying
this
to say is like even then, even though they have imagined, and even though there is all this regulation, there's really bad things happening with reproductive technologies right now in this moment, because we just didn't imagine who are going to be the actors that are going to, like, bad actors at the regulatory level, right? And so I think those are the kind of
Yeah.
we'll have a longer conversation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, part of the wickedness of this problem is that we don't just live in a technical world. We don't just live in a socio-technical world. We also live in a socio-technical political world. And the politics of it, even though CS people tend to call politics everything that they don't want to deal with, that's actually what swings a lot of this stuff, I think.
I guess I just want to say that.
Yeah.
Maybe people just refuse to imagine really bad things because then the world will look like a really bad place to them, and it's not worth living that life.
So we should move on, but I will argue with you. I have a project right now I am the only person you know that's read about 30,000 Fox News comments. And I can tell you there are people who do not want to live in a hopeful world. But we can have this debate. I think overall that is part of the imaginary.
But it might be associated with the people who are drawn to building the technologies are hopeful, right? And that makes it.
Yeah. And I think part of the draw of the imaginary is this hopefulness, right? I'm not drawn towards dystopian imaginaries.
I have something that is like almost a proto-hypothesis. So I'm just curious, like it's not even well formed enough to call it a hypothesis. Just to get your reaction. It seems like maybe some of the wickedness here is actually a difficulty in projecting kind of how far diffuse something goes. So if you ask me to predict, at time of paper submission, which of my projects sort of barely get in by the skin of the teeth and are never sort of heard from again versus ones that have impact, like I don't know, maybe I'm better than chance, but I don't know that I'm much better than chance. And then when we're thinking through these impacts and mitigations, I find that I'm often sort of at some meso level of diffusion. So it's like, okay, this thing that we're creating, maybe by default, I'm not assuming it's going to be used just by academics. I'm going to think about what motivated actors might do or something like this. But I'm also not saying communication technologies, what happens when multiple layers of diffusion out, it's going to occur. And it feels like maybe that's part of the path dependence, but it feels like for me, part of the challenge is that we actually maybe can't, we're not good at predicting sort of, P3P, yes, this will be used by a small to medium group to deal with privacy policies. Oh, but then after that, if that becomes successful, now companies are going to start using it for ad network. It actually became more successful than anticipated. And we can anticipate out to certain levels of success. Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. That's one of the dimensions of the wickedness. Maybe it's two of the dimensions, but there are also others, right? So the context is also shifting.
Sure.
Right.
The context is tied to the diffusion.
Okay, we can debate that later, but it seems they're interwoven, right? I mean, it's in socio-historical phenomena. It's very difficult to come up with a single line of causation. And so I think it's these feedback loops that make it really, really difficult to understand. So you're absolutely right. If the world were, well, if the world were linear, maybe we could build a model, but the world's not even linear, right? And so I think it becomes even more difficult. All right.
Yeah, we've time for maybe one more.
Oh, sure.
So, I wanted to talk about so I think a previous commenter said maybe we don't want to imagine how bad the world can be because then it would just be a world we don't want to live in. But I think it also goes beyond that to as a society, we have in any relationship or transaction, there's an inbuilt level of trust. You just have to trust the people around you. That's why, there's, for example, windows on first floor dorms. You're not assuming someone's going to try and break in. You just do, there's a base level of trust that people are not going to try and actively harm you. Or, even when you're shopping online, you're assuming that there are going to send you the things even if they're being authorized. And but then obviously then there's different considerations that come up in social computing as well because but I think just what do you think about assuming a level of trust for users as well? How far do you think that goes into this?
Well, I think that goes back to your point too. I think it's a great point. I'm feeling a little contrary today, so I'm going to say I think that's only part of what people do, and I think it's only what some people do. And one of the problems with these really complex socio-historical situations is you're kind of dealing with body politic in general. And what can I say? I've read 30,000 Fox News comments. Not everybody believes that. The thing that I'm finding the most in the Fox News, these are all about COVID, is just the level of distrust that the participants have, and I think they're echoing the Fox News commentators. So I think that's great, and I actually think Michael's comment was really good. We, the people in this room, probably came to technology because we were drawn to doing something interesting and useful in the world, right? And so we are trusting that the future will be better, or we're hoping that the future will be better. I suspect none of you have decided to build a more awful world. I hope. And so this is the baby Hitler problem, right? If you want to build a more awful world, come up and talk to me later. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the situation is that, yeah, we want the world. There are many people who want that imaginary. That imaginary, those kinds of imaginaries draw us in. We as computer science type people. And that's part of the power of that particular almost meme, which is don't regulate because it'll stifle the really cool stuff. And I think we need to be cautious about that.
All right, let's thank our speaker.